Welcome back to Arachnid Alley. I'm Connor Fulmer. So we're going to be talking about just basic beginner tarantula husbandry and kind of what to expect. Maybe it's your first tarantula or you're just looking into potentially getting one and you want to see if it's going to be a good fit for you. I remember when I got my first tarantula, I just went to a pet store and I was like, hey, that one has really pretty colors and I want it, and so I bought it and I took it home and I found out it was this thing called an OBT, which if you haven't heard of, OBT stands for Orange Baboon Tarantula, but most people know them as the orange bitey thing, and as that name would suggest, they are not the best first tarantula. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk to you about first, is when you are going to get a tarantula, you need to find out if it's what we call arboreal, meaning climbs way up in the trees, lives in the trees, sometimes underneath the bark or between the leaves or whatnot, or if it's what we call terrestrial, which means it digs in the dirt, underneath rocks, and the roots, and different things like that. Okay? If you have an arboreal tarantula, they're going to want to climb up high and they're going to produce their webbing, right? So this tarantula that I have right here is known as a carabina versicolor. They're a really popular first spider. A lot of people have them, and for good reason. They're stunning, beautiful colors. Definitely look into them if you're interested in that. Just as far as the general care goes, for an arboreal tarantula, you're going to want to get something that has some good height and maybe put something in there that it can web onto, right? So some people will have a single branch going across, or a couple of branches, or maybe a single branch with some fake or live plants, so that it can have lots of different anchor points and it can be able to go and do the things that it was made to do, right? As far as terrestrial tarantulas go, you're going to want a bigger enclosure as far as foot space and less height. Now, just because a tarantula might be terrestrial or arboreal, that does not mean that an arboreal tarantula will never dig or a terrestrial tarantula will never climb, okay? And that's part of the reason why we want a small enclosure for a terrestrial tarantula, because sometimes they will climb up the sides, and if you have something that's really tall, and that tarantula can and is more likely than an arboreal to take a fall, that can cause problems. So make sure that the enclosure for a terrestrial tarantula is a lot smaller as far as height, but bigger as far as the foot space, so that it has plenty of space to walk all over and do what it needs to do. The other important thing with a terrestrial tarantula is to make sure that they have some space to burrow. Now, different species are going to need more or less burrowing space. As you can see in some of these enclosures, I have some arboreals, some terrestrials, and the ones that need a lot of burrowing space, you can barely see it in the top of the camera, but I keep them up on top here, and they have a lot more dirt, and so they will burrow clear down to the bottom, and that's simply just based on the specific cares of different tarantulas. Some terrestrial tarantulas will stay up on the top of the substrate a lot more often, and I've found that they don't really tend to burrow, and so they can use a little bit less substrate, but just, again, cater that to the individual care of your spider. So, terrestrial means they dig, shorter enclosure, bigger footprint. Arboreal tarantula means they like to climb, they need to have things to anchor their webbing to, such as branches, fake or live plants, and be able to just expand and make their little webbing nest, if you will, up in the canopies that way. As far as the care of and the husbandry of the spiders, we'll go over the basic husbandries, but I want to say that every single spider has its own varied care requirements. Some spiders are from Mexico and they're a lot more dry. Other species are from India and Asia, areas over there, and they're a lot more wet. So this basic care guide is going to have some tips and tricks for each different kind of species, but I highly recommend going on and finding a specific care video. If I don't have one up, go find someone else that's got one and make sure that you figure out Is it a wet species? Is it a dry species? What kinds of things it likes to do. Okay, so with that being said, let's jump into this. I'm going to go ahead and put this enclosure down. And we're going to focus on this girl here. So this is my Antilles pink toe, or Caribbean versicolor. She's a big female, and I've had her for quite some time now. And the things that I'm going to tell you as far as care of a tarantula goes, just know that I don't have all the answers. This isn't the end-all be-all. This is simply what I do, what I have found that works, and what I have found that helps my tarantulas live a happier, healthier life. So looking at this enclosure, you'll see, like we mentioned, it has the height. And then if you look inside here, you can see it has quite a few different anchor points. There's a live plant here. And on the back, there's a stick that she's kind of more or less covered almost completely, but it comes up through here and she has just webbed it completely. You can see she has a beautiful webbing all over the place, and she's actually sitting right up on top, just finishing up a dubia roach that she snagged a little while ago. The other thing is the substrate. And now this is a big topic that different people have different opinions, different answers for everything. I really like to use cocoa fiber. Other people will use more vermiculite or peat moss or just normal topsoil, organic topsoil. There's no wrong answer. Find what you like and find what works best for you and stick with that. I really like to use about 80% cocoa fiber. I'll throw in maybe 10% peat moss, and then I will add some sphagnum moss, some vermiculite, some sand. That helps with drainage so that your substrate doesn't constantly sit and be damp and cause mold and issues like that. But honestly, just going and buying a brick of cocoa fiber from your nearest pet store, putting it all in here, they're going to be just fine. But I like to have a good inch to 2, maybe 3 inches of substrate. That helps it so that the cocoa fiber doesn't dry out so fast, and that your spider can have that humidity that it needs. So alongside the substrate, we need to make sure that your spider has its basic needs for survival, right? So those basic needs are going to be food, water, shelter. Okay, we've covered the shelter part quite well. So let's talk about water. Super simple. A lot of people will like to go and they'll mist the enclosures, and your spider will go and it'll kind of suck it up to the side of the glass or on the webbing or the plants, and it will drink right off of there. But it is very important as well that you make sure that you have some kind of a water dish in there so that your tarantula can go and find water if it needs to. In the wild, these guys will drink off of leaves, other plants, some rocks, whatever they can find that will hold water if they are thirsty, they will go for that. Same with your terrestrial species. This is the same care. Wherever your water dish is, I fill it up all the way, and then I let it overflow just a little bit, keeping that one corner of your enclosure damp. You don't need to spray the entire enclosure and get everything nice and wet. Unless it's a really, really wet species, then you can wet the whole thing down. But generally, just overflowing the water dish in that one corner just a little bit will help get that ambient humidity up a little bit higher in the enclosure and will help your spider feel a lot happier. Now, that takes care of shelter and water. Now let's move on to food. So, probably one of the best parts about owning a tarantula is feeding time. They're really aggressive eaters. They'll attack it, and it's just really fun to watch a spider just pounce on their prey. But it's quite simple. I mean, tarantulas will eat nearly anything that moves, and it really just varies depending on the size of the spider for the size of food that you want to give it. Now, the best tip that I can give for knowing how big of a prey item to give your spider is just look at the carapace. Now, the carapace is the head segment on the tarantula where all the eyeballs are. Look at that size and try to give it something Not much bigger than that. Now, if you're starting with, let's say, a tiny little dwarf species like a Cyrocosmus species, your baby tarantula is just going to be itty bitty, and it's going to be hard to find food for something like that. Now, there's a couple options you can do. One option is springtails. However, if you don't have access to springtails or you don't want to find them, you can go to your pet store and you can find just crickets, and you can rip the legs off, say the back hopping legs off of a cricket, and you put that hopping leg down in that enclosure, and your spider will come and find it, and it'll suck up all the nutrients that it needs from that. The other option would be to crush the head of a small cricket or something and put it in there, and it will come and find the cricket, and it will eat from that as well. So there's a couple different options with your small species, or just with your babies. However, with your bigger ones, just look at the size of the carapace. Now, if you've got something like your Goliath bird eaters, you're going to be like, well, how am I going to find something that's, that big? You can feed multiple things. You don't have to reach the full size of the carapace, but that's just a good kind of rule of thumb. Now, it's pretty common for an adult spider that you're going to feed it, say 2 or 3 crickets once a week. You can go once every other week. I generally wouldn't advise to go less than 2 weeks from feeding your spiders, unless, of course, it's in pre-molt. Your spider doesn't do a whole lot. They generally hide. They're not eating. They just don't do much. And so, but this is probably the number one thing that freaks people out, is that, oh no, my spider's not eating. What did I do wrong? If your spider's abdomen, which is the butt section, if your spider's abdomen is plump and it's not eating, don't worry about it. Now, if you're watching your spider's abdomen slowly get smaller and it's still not eating, that's when I would start to worry. That's when it can be a problem, and you've got to figure out, sometimes that means they don't have enough water, they're dehydrated, so they need some water. There can be a various number of things, and that's a topic for another time. Another important thing about feeding your spider is, if it has freshly molted, you want to wait at least 1, if not 2 full weeks, so that your spider can harden up, because when a spider is molted, and we'll talk about that in a second, but when your spider molts, its fangs also get molted, and when their fangs molt off, their new ones are really soft, and they can easily be broken. And so if you try to feed your spider too early, it may break a fang, and if it breaks a fang, it becomes really hard for your spider to eat. And you may walk in one day, and you're going to see that your spider is flipped upside down, and you're going to freak out, and you're going to say, what is happening? Don't worry, this is perfectly normal and quite exciting, actually. When spiders molt, they will flip on their backs, and they will push their exoskeleton off of them, and it'll just peel off, and then it'll, fall down next to them, and it'll look like you have 2 tarantulas in that enclosure, which can be kind of startling if you walk in and you're like, it multiplied. Don't worry, it didn't actually multiply. You just have your spider that is freshly molted, which means its colors are going to be so much more vibrant and pretty. Your spider's going to be bigger. It's just an exciting time to be a tarantula owner and have something molt. It's always fun. If it's on its back, do not touch it. That's the other thing. When a spider is molting, you do not want to interfere with the process. The spider is very fragile at that time, and you do not want to disrupt it. If you go in there and you're poking and prodding it, there is a high likelihood that you are going to cause damage or potentially kill your tarantula. So if it is on its back and for a couple of days afterwards, do not touch it. Just admire from outside. See the process. It's an amazing process. But don't pick up the enclosure. Don't open the enclosure. Don't touch your spider. Just leave them be to do their thing, and then after a couple of days, they're going to be just fine. Another important thing with your tarantulas is to do tank maintenance. Now, the maintenance includes the water, making sure that their water bowl is always filled up, overflowing just a little bit, and all of that kind of thing. The other part is cleaning up after your spider. Now, you can see in the front here there's a little bit of white on the front, that is the tarantula's dung. And you can easily, just with a wet rag, you can go and you can wipe it off and clean it up. I like to go throughout my enclosures every couple weeks and just wipe off all the poo. Just make sure that it looks a lot nicer. The other part about having a tarantula is just cleaning up what's called a bolus. Now, a bolus is basically the leftover food from the tarantula that it didn't eat. They'll bunch all this up into just this mangled mess, and they're going to stick it generally in a single corner. Now, kind of a funny thing I have noticed, tarantulas are pretty clean. They don't poop in their webbing. They don't poop in their burrow. They'll generally come and they'll stick their butt out and they'll kind of projectile on the front glass or something like that. And usually in that same area in one corner, they drop all of their boluses. It's not 100%, but I've just noticed that most of my tarantulas will kind of find a corner that's generally the furthest away from their home, and that's kind of where they'll stash all of their boluses and things, which makes it super easy for me because I just come in with my tongs and I just pick them out, throw them in the garbage, and we're done. Temperature and humidity. Now, these two things are going to vary drastically for every different tarantula, and I think one of the biggest problems that people have when they're having a lot of casualties with their tarantulas is that they're trying to hit very specific numbers. It's really not manageable, it's really hard to do, and honestly I think it puts a lot more stress on your tarantula. Your spiders generally like to be left alone. They're not social animals, and the more we go and we're opening their enclosures and we're squirting them down with water and doing all these things to try to keep the humidity right where we want it, it just tends to stress the spider out. So long as they have a water dish, some species do like to be allowed to dry out. Now, an example of that would be your rosehair tarantula. Those ones like to have drier substrate, so keep a water dish filled so that they have access to water, but let that substrate dry. As soon as it's pretty dry, spray it down, just overflow the water dish like we talked about. Do something like that, and that will help your spider be happier. With your species that are more humid and they're not so dry, like the rosehair, let's say your Poecilotheria genus, for example, you're going to want to keep their substrate more damp. You're going to want to keep a higher humidity in there. Now, that does mean that maybe instead of, like your rosehair, you might be able to go in there every week and just fill up the water dish, but you don't need to overflow the water dish necessarily. Whereas with your pokies, you need to be weekly filling up their water dish, overflowing it, letting it be wet. Okay, so that's the difference. When you're online, do not hit the numbers. Do not look for the exact percentage of humidity. It does not matter. If it's a wet species, make sure that you're giving it water more often. If it's a dry species, don't give it so much water. Let it dry out. It's as simple as that, really. It's the more technical you get and the more you try to hit those numbers, the more stress you're putting on the animal, and honestly, just the worse results you're going to get. In my experience, that's what I've seen. Now, very similar thing with temperatures. There's a lot of different ways to hit temperatures. The best way, if you have it, is you have your animal room, you just crank the temperature up, you block the vents, whatever you got to do in that room to make sure that the room itself stays warmer. That way there's not a lot of difference in the time of day or anything like that. You can kind of keep it at a constant 75, 80 degrees. So when I didn't have an animal room before, I would use heat pads or heat tape. You can kind of see it through here behind the enclosures, but it is on the back wall of my enclosure. I have heat tape on there, and every single shelf has its own strip of heat tape, and it is all plugged into a thermostat, which is on the side here. So that's the important thing. If you are going to use heat pads at all, please, please, please use a thermostat. There can be problems where the heat pad can melt and catch things on fire, or it just heats your enclosure up way, way, way too much, and your spider will essentially get burned, or it'll suffer because it'll suck out all the humidity out of your enclosure. There's a whole lot of problems if your temperatures are way too high. Same goes, however, if it's way too low, your spider is going to be suffering. So the best way to heat your enclosures is to use heat pads connected to a thermostat. So that's the best way that I have found to heat your spiders and make sure that they stay at a good temperature. A good range for almost every species of tarantula is going to be 70 up to like 80 to even 95 sometimes. Different people keep their rooms and their enclosures at different temperatures. Most spiders thrive around 80 degrees. I usually keep my enclosures, my thermostat is at 75. Again, please, this is the general care guide. Go find the specifics of your spider. If it's wet, overflow the water dish more often. Make sure that the substrate stays more damp. If it's dry, don't overflow it so often. Let it dry. If it's a warm species that's used to the heat, put it up higher on your shelf. The heat rises and it's always going to be warmer up here. And if they're cooler, put them down here. Awesome. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. And like I said in the beginning, I don't have all the answers. This is what I have done. This is what works for me in my house. But I would like to hear from you guys. What things do you do, or what did I miss in this video that you think I should have added? So please leave that in the comments, or anything else. I will check and I will answer all the questions. And I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you next time.